Okay, so what can go wrong when you're on a trip and what can you do about it? Plenty and just about enough to keep going are the answers you're looking for. So let me go through the three main ways my latest trip has gone haywire and how I have put them right. Well, kind of. Some of the stuff is going to take some more long-term thinking, but let me go back to the beginning and then I'll share some lessons that I've learned or had at the forefront of my mind when I was preparing and what I went through when sorting this trip out and trying to problem solve on the way. By the way, I'm just about to leave for Heathrow Airport, recording this using my iPhone and my Rode Wireless Mic Pro. And this is going to be a one-take recording, and my flight is not only later than I had planned, but it's also going somewhere completely different to where I had originally intended, to a country I've never been to before. Let's go back to the start. So, the whole point of my trip was to see my parents, as well as see some interesting things and create some cool content along the way. Now, I used to go back to the UK to see my family twice a year, but in recent years, that of course hasn't been possible. But I'm trying to get back into the rhythm of doing that again. But the thing is, prices of flights have gone up shockingly when you compare from 2019 to now. Anyway, from New Zealand to the UK and return anyway. So cost is definitely an issue. So here was my solution, and it's a risky one, and one I've avoided doing before, and certainly not one I would risk if I had the kids with me. I have a lot of points in the British Airways frequent flyer program called Avios that I want to use. The problem is that British Airways do not fly to New Zealand. Well, not directly anyway. And it's certainly difficult to find any routing that gets me to Wellington, even on their partner airlines. Now, the problem with using partner airlines in the Avios program is that your points immediately become devalued by 50%, sometimes more, and the co-payment for taxes and all the other fees increase as well. So, part one of my mission was to find a routing from London that flew to a place that I could connect to flying from New Zealand. And this is how I ended up in Shanghai. I found a cheapish Air New Zealand flight that got me to and from Shanghai. And I booked a British Airways rewards seat flight using those frequent flyer Avios points that got me from Shanghai to London and back again. Now, the problem with split itineraries like this is that if anything happens and you miss your connection, well, that's on you. If it was a single itinerary, the carrier is responsible for getting you to your final destination. But on a split itinerary, the carrying airline only needs to get you to whatever your connection point is. And if there are cancellations or delays because of weather or other issues, well, sorry about that, but it's not really our problem as far as the connection is concerned. So I built in almost 3 days in Shanghai on my outward leg between those major flights, and another 36 hours between my flight arriving from London in Shanghai and my flight leaving Shanghai for New Zealand. So far, so good. I had some wiggle room if things went wrong. And at this point, I started to get a little bit overconfident maybe. And I booked a side trip using those frequent flyer miles on British Airways to Lisbon in Portugal for 2 nights, as I'd never been there before. And I wanted a little bit of a side adventure. So that's the scene. Now let's start talking about how all this starts to go wrong. First, Typhoon Babinka hits Shanghai, meaning that my flight leaves New Zealand almost a day later than planned. Well, I mean, when 400,000 people are evacuated from Shanghai because of the worst typhoon in 75 years, I can understand the delay, but it did mean I meant a whole day in Shanghai was gone. But I made my flight to the UK from Shanghai and I arrived pretty much intact and all good. So major objective achieved. Now, 5 days later, I'm on an early morning flight to Lisbon and I have a wonderful day in the Portuguese capital, wondering why it took me so long to discover how great this city is in person. And that's when the second thing goes wrong. I get a text from my sister on the second morning in Lisbon asking me to call her urgently. My mum had had a fall in the house and she was not in a good way. And if we wind back a couple of days, I'd just had a heart-to-heart with my parents about how I thought they needed to sell their house and move somewhere that was easier for them given their age. like not having any stairs. Now, up until this point, whenever I'd mentioned this over the previous 2 decades, 20 years, they had rejected the idea. But this time seemed a little different. They seemed to recognize that being in their 80s, this house was much less than ideal. And even though they had not moved from this house since the 1960s, maybe they were considering that the time was actually right now. So it's ironic that just 2 days before, I had urged them to consider moving before something bad happened and not to wait for that moment, but to take charge and move before it happened. Well, it happened. Now, at first, we thought she had experienced some kind of cardiac event because she mentioned through her moaning after her fall that she had had pain on her left side before she fell. I made sure the ambulance had been called and had that information, and then got on to the phone to British Airways to try to cut my trip short and get back to London. Unfortunately, though, all I managed to achieve over the next few hours was finding out that they had no availability on their flights at all and could only route me back through Finland, which would get me back just 2 or 3 hours before I was due home the following day anyway. And that was through multiple drop calls, very frustrating, and me getting quite worried. And I was getting calls from texts from London, updating me with the latest, as well as asking for advice throughout that morning and afternoon. My sister was wonderful through all this, I should say. As it turned out, it didn't seem to be a cardiac event after all, with the CT scan and ECGs coming back looking okay, and she didn't look like she'd fractured anything when she fell either. NHS was great. So I didn't rush back, but was checking in hourly as the weather in Lisbon turned ugly and rainy, and my mood turned away from having fun and just being worried about my mum. So I got back as scheduled the following day, well, actually about 2 hours late for some reason, but such is modern travel. So we come to the third thing that went wrong, and this is the big one. As I was on a local train, I checked my email and I saw an email from British Airways, and it had the sort of header that made my blood run cold. I clicked on the email and found out that my flight on October the 2nd to Shanghai had been cancelled. And the airline advised me to click the button to go online to book another flight. And I could feel the blood draining from my face as I clicked that button. And I looked throughout the booking engine for the following days from the date after my flight was cancelled. And I looked at all the before dates too. And the only date I could find was leaving London on the 5th of October. The problem was that my flight to New Zealand left Shanghai on the 4th of October. So this was my nightmare coming true. So I got off the internet and I called the British Airways contact number. So some 2 hours later of me standing in a park, being rained on, and finally finding someone helpful, I'd gone through a process of elimination to find a routing and a flight that worked. Now, at first they said that the only flights available were 5th of October and 30th of September. Now, the 30th September flight was better, but it would mean having to pay for 3 extra nights of accommodation in Shanghai during China's Golden Week celebrations, which would have cost a lot. So after there were any other ways around this or any routings around this, and the agent said that she could possibly look at alternative routings through partner airlines. Now, once I'd clarified that this would not cost me any extra because British Airways had cancelled my flight, she started to check them out. And that's how I ended up booked on to my upcoming British Airways flight later today to Doha, connecting to a Qatar Airways flight to Shanghai from there. The only problem is that I lose almost an entire day again. Instead of arriving into Shanghai at 7 a.m, I'm arriving at 4:15 p.m, meaning I won't get to my hotel till about 8 p.m, and I'll have to leave my hotel the following day at 9 a.m, to get back to the airport for my flight back to New Zealand. But at least I was booked on a flight that connects now. I just hope I don't get delayed and I get there on time. So here are the lessons I've learned from what I can do when things go wrong when I travel like they have done on this trip. First, having cell phone call coverage is really important. My UK cell provider is giffgaff, and they offered me unlimited calls in the UK, but also offered me free roaming calls in the UK too for the little package that I bought, just £6 for the month. Now, that was very useful to have while calling my dad and my sister repeatedly whilst I was stuck in Lisbon. and my mum was taken sick and being checked out in hospital. I'll also call in British Airways too, even though I didn't have any luck there. Now, second was making sure that I had data covered too. My Holofly Global eSIM worked well no matter what destination I was in, and I just turned it on and I got a decent mobile data connection. And that was useful even to confirm that I could not get a flight that I wanted and I needed to call the British Airways contact center. Now, third, it's that when I was trying to get on a flight to Shanghai, the contact center could make it happen, even when it didn't look like there were any options online. And although it took 2 hours to figure out a solution, we eventually got there. So my lesson learned there is that online is definitely not everything. Call the contact center if online is not working. Now, fourth was that I was very wise to build in go wrong time into my split itineraries. The time I left available was pretty tight. 36 hours is the minimum I would put in between your itineraries, depending upon your flight schedules for your particular routing. And fifth, know that split itineraries are pretty risky for all the reasons I've outlined here today. I'm reasonably happy with how mine has worked out. In theory, I've still got to really execute this second return home, but it's pretty stressful when things go off track. And I'm pretty stressed now, hoping that this flight is not delayed. And when you're trying to find a way of trying to get things back on track again when they go wrong, particularly because I only have about 48 hours slack to get home, as my wife is leaving for a trip almost immediately after I get back, and I need to be home to look after the kids. And there is no way I would do this kind of thing if I had our kids with me. Trying to find seats on a rerouted frequent flyer miles flight when there's only a certain number of seats put aside for those kinds of tickets. Now that would be super challenging, I think. So, right, that's it from me. Time for me to get this uploaded. Let me know what you think below. Has anything like this happened to you? And check out this video next, and I'll see you there. Cheers.